Hello everyone, so in the last video I covered how to stay within style and how to make sure that you are consistent and that your style and that your models look consistent across a whole environment. And so in this video I want to talk about workflow and how to properly set up your models so that when you bake you get correct bakes. And so I'm going to be showing you my settings for everything and my usual workflow. I'm actually going to be showing you two workflows that I typically use. So let me show you the first one first. And this is the workflow that I use the most. So my usual workflow is I create my low poly model in Maya usually. Obviously you can create your low poly model in Zbrush if you want to, but me personally I prefer to do it in Maya just because I'm used to it and it just feels more natural for me. And so here I'm going to be showing you using this model here. So this is my crate with gold bars. So I created this model in Maya. This is my low poly, and this is the first thing that I did. I created the model, and this is what I consider to be the final model, so the low poly. And so the next step in the workflow is to first create the model, and then so that's my low poly, and create your UVs. So these are the UVs for us. It actually includes these. And the UVs can be created now, so after you created the low poly, or you can do it after you're done with Zbrush. And the reason sometimes I do it after Zbrush is because if the model changes a lot while I'm in Zbrush, I may have to make some changes to the low poly as well. And then if you do that, sometimes you have to redo UVs. So in this case, I just did them before Zbrush. And so the next thing I do is, I'm ready to export this to Substance Painter and then to Zbrush. So what I do is I select my model. Let me open the outliner here. And I group it into one group. And then I name it. So this is my low poly. So I use the underscore low. And so in Substance Painter, I use what you call bake by name. And so let me show you something. So I have these pieces here. And when I bake my normal map and all my maps in Substance Painter, I don't want these to be affecting the actual crate here. So if I export these as one model and bake my normal map, when I bake my normal map, the details from this model are going to be baked on this as well. So you're going to see some bleeding. So you're going to see normal map details baked on here, the actual crate, and I don't want that. And so that's a trick that you can use if you don't want things to be like bleeding into each other. And that's usually what people ask me a lot about, is how to not get those artifacts like when you have things really close to each other. So that's how you fix that, is you want to first separate those models. So if you don't want the bake from this to affect this model, you want to separate it. And so that's what I have done here. I've separated the pieces that I don't want affecting each other into different models here, and then I named them, and I gave them a number, and then included the underscore low at the end. So you always want to add the underscore low, because that's how Substance Painter knows that this is the low poly, and this is how it matches it to the high poly model. So the next thing I do is I select the group, and then I go to export selection, and then here what I do is I make sure that I'm using the FBX export. And the reason I do that is because the FBX export type allows you to have things in groups. If you export as an OBJ, which I think is the default when you're trying to export, the OBJ doesn't really support the groups and doesn't really like look into that. And by the way, if you don't see the FBX option in Maya, if you're using Maya, go to Windows, Settings, Preferences, Plugin Manager, and here all the way at the bottom usually you can look at here's the FBX Maya.mll. Make sure this is loaded and auto load, and just refresh and close it. Once that's done, make sure you go back to your export selection, select the FBX export type, and before you export it, there are some settings that you absolutely need to check. And if you don't do this, it's going to mess up your bake in Substance Painter, which is also one thing that people ask me a lot, is why they're getting so many errors and artifacts. And so in Maya, you have to make sure you set smoothing groups on and tangents and binormals. This makes sure that the normals of your model are correct when you import them into Substance Painter. If you don't select that, the normals don't necessarily export correctly. You also want to disable everything else because you don't need that. Like I think by default smooth mesh is on, but you don't want that. You don't want to smooth that. And everything else at the bottom, it's defaults. You can just leave it as default and export your model. Oh, one more thing I didn't cover is for your low poly, before you export, you're going to go under Mesh, Display, Soften, Harden Edges, click the Options box and set this to Texture Borders, and then Apply. And that's going to make sure that where you have a UV seam, it's going to harden the edges, and everything else is going to be softened edges. And if you want to do that for each model, you can't just select the whole thing and do it because it's not going to do it. You have to do one by one, unfortunately. So that's annoying, but you have to do it that way. But essentially, it's going to harden edges wherever you have a UVC, and everything else is going to be a soft edge. And I find that that gives usually good results for baking normal maps in Substance Painter. Okay, so that covers how to set up your model and export it from Maya. And that's going to be the low poly we're going to use for both Zbrush and Substance Painter. So now let me show you in Zbrush what I usually do. Okay, so in Zbrush now, what you want to do is you want to import your FBX model. And unfortunately, Zbrush has a lot of menus which have an import button. And so the usual one that you see here is under Tool, you see the Import 3D Mesh. But you don't want to use this one because this one is to import an OBJ file. And we didn't use that type of file. So I think this is the one that people usually get confused with. So you want to go under the C plugin menu. And then here there's the FBX export import. And you want to use this one to import your model. One thing you want to do is click on the options and make sure you don't import your camera because you don't really need it when you're sculpting. So import your low poly model that we exported from Maya. And don't worry that it's named low poly. Once we export it, we're going to name it high poly. And I just drag this in. And obviously, my workflow is usually I press P here for perspective. Typically, what I do is I want to add some bevels. So I do this in Maya or ZBrush, but I usually like to add bevels. And for that, I typically use the C Remeasure. The C Modeler tool. Then here under when I go into an edge, do the bevel, and then I start to bevel some of the edges. And this is so that when I divide the model, it actually holds up and it doesn't like break the shape. But I'm not going to show you every single thing here because I'm not going to redo this from scratch. But anyway, once I do that, typically I divide it. So in this case, it didn't hold up because I haven't beveled it. But then once I divided that, I really like to use the Dynamesh because it adds more geo, and I don't think we have to go like super high poly. I think it's messing up because I didn't like bevel it. But that's usually what I do. I Dynamesh it, I sculpt it, and I add my details. And then finally I do a clay polish. And so let's pretend this is our high poly. Before you export, what you want to do is here, as you can see here, it's named _low. You want to rename this. So we're going to go under rename and change the _low to _high because that's going to be like super useful for baking based on names in Substance Painter, which is why we separated some of the props into different things. Also, when you rename in ZBrush, one thing you have to be aware of is that ZBrush capitalizes the first letter. So make sure that if you're renaming in ZBrush, make sure in Maya, the first letter is also capitalized for your low poly models. So make sure these are all renamed high. And then once that's done, all you have to do is export and then export that as your high poly model. Okay, so that's pretty much how I export from ZBrush. And Now I'll show you the Substance Painter import and settings. Okay, so in Substance Painter, what you want to do obviously is select your low poly model, import that, now choose whatever document size you want to use, and then obviously you can change that later as well. And just click OK, and then that imports your model. The first thing I usually do when I import is I always check my UVs first, so make sure you're looking at the 3D 2D view here, and I'm just looking for making sure that my UVs are there and that they look exactly like they did in Maya. And if they don't, obviously go back to Maya and make sure that they are looking good. Also, I like to look at my texture set list, and I want to make sure that I'm only using one material. Obviously, if you have something that you want to use multiple materials, make sure you check that too. And if I see more than one material here, but I only want one, I go back to Maya and assign one material to everything and then re-export and re-import. So that's what I do first. And then the second thing is I want to bake by normal map. And so I go here under bake maps. And typically I deselect all of these first because I don't want to wait for these to bake if there's like an issue with the normal map. And so I'm going to change that to 1024 because that's what I'm working with. And then under high definition mesh, I import my high poly. Typically I use the default frontal and rear distances, but sometimes I find that I have to increase it. And then I set the anti-aliasing to 4x4. And then here under match, this is where the naming comes into place. If you named your high poly with underscore high and then underscore low. And obviously I think you can change that to, it doesn't have to be underscore high or low, you can change that to whatever. But make sure you change that here too. And so once that's done, I usually just hit bake and then just wait for it to bake. So it's pretty fast. And the next thing I do is I look for artifacts and make sure that everything looks good. So let's see, let's get real close here. So as you can see here, there's a little bit of there's a line here from our normal map. And the way I would fix that is, you can kind of see it here too. So typically you get that if your normals are not set correctly, or your UVs may have some distortion, or your low poly just doesn't match your high poly that well. And that's usually the case. It's usually the low poly not matching the high poly too well. So maybe I added too much of a bevel to the high poly. And so the way to fix this particular artifact would be to go back to my low poly and add an extra edge loop here, or bevel it a little bit more. And that will most likely fix it. Now, that really depends on the model. So this would probably be a somewhat small prop. You probably see it from this distance. So if you're looking at something at a distance, for the most part, small artifacts like that, it doesn't really matter too much. And also once you have colors on it, it's not going to be too noticeable. So for things that you're not looking at up close, like unless you're like this close to it, it really doesn't matter. Like you can just leave it as is, and you're not going to notice it that much. But if you are getting like super close and this is like a hero prop or something, I would add the extra bevels to the low poly and then just bake it. And that will most likely fix these issues. But usually I just leave it because I know I'm not going to get that close to it anyway. So there's that. Sometimes too, if you can also try to increase the frontal and rear distances. And sometimes that also kind of helps with that, but not always. So as you can see, it didn't really help with that. Okay, so the next thing is I usually bake these other maps, the curvature. So for the curvature, you want to disable seams because you really don't want to bake that in. And usually I just lower this to a really low setting. And then position, I just leave it as the default. Thickness, if I'm using the name match, I also assign this here under the self occlusion for my thickness, and then I bake these. Then the next one's going to be the ambient occlusion. Okay, so that's done. And then the final one that I do is the ambient occlusion. The reason I wait for this for last is because it usually takes the longest to bake. And so here under self-occlusion, this is where you can decide if you want this to be by the name, so that you don't get occlusion from each prop. And for my settings, usually I just make the default, but lately I've been using I've been changing this to uniform and then increasing my distance and the raise just a little bit. I find that this gives good ambient occlusion for like stylized stuff. And the reason I increase the distance is because it makes it so that the occlusion is not concentrated on the edges of your prop, and it's more like across the entire surface. So as you can see, that it looks a little bit more softer. So that's kind of what you get. It just gets like a softer look to the ambient occlusion. And that's pretty much it for the bake settings. And then after that, I start using my smart material and then just do the texture. So let me open it with the whole texture and everything. So here's the final one with the textures. And as you can see, as I was mentioning with the seam that was present here, it's not that noticeable with the texture on. Obviously it's still there, but it's not super noticeable. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is when you get those, don't be like super alarmed by it. And unless you are supposed to get like super close to it, then add the extra bevel to the low poly before you import here. And that's usually fixes it. So once I'm done, obviously I'm ready to just export my textures. I make sure that I name my texture set here, and then I do the export textures. And obviously it depends on what your need is and what you're using this for. If you're exporting for Unreal, you can use the Unreal packed setting, or you can just make your own. When I'm baking for Marmoset Toolbag, I just use the default exporting settings, and I just get those textures from that. So that's pretty much it for this workflow, where you make the low poly Maya, sculpt it in ZBrush, and then just texture here in Substance Painter. So the other workflow I was going to cover was, let's say you start in ZBrush, for example. Let's say I started this in ZBrush. Actually, let me open the high poly one. Okay, so here's the ZBrush file. And so let's say I created this in ZBrush, or I imported it from Maya, but I made like way too many changes to the low poly, to the model, so that my low poly no longer matches my high poly. So the other workflow is the retopology workflow. And so for that, what I usually do is I try the ZBrush retopology first, just to see what I get. And so if I had to retopologize this model, for example, what I would try first is I would go to geometry and look for Z remeasure. And I don't know, let's set this to like 2K or something. And I would try to retopologize it through this first, just to see what I get. And so I usually just set it to the default settings, and then just reduce the target poly count a little bit, and then just click on here. And okay, so this is what I got, which is not really great. It looks a little lumpy. It's not really supporting my hard edges. And so that's usually what I try first, and if I don't get something that I like, I decide that I'm going to have to retopologize it by scratch. And so first thing you want to do is you want to decide if you actually want to retopo it, or if you want to use a decimated model. So a decimated model is, let me actually click here, and under decimation master, I do a pre-process current. And essentially a decimated model is an auto reduction of the poly count of a model in ZBrush. Okay, let me open this. And so let's say I want this to be 1000 polys, and I just decimate it, and this is what I get. So this is a decimated model. So it just reduces the poly count. It also triangulates it here in ZBrush. And usually, so there are a few things that you can usually use if this is not going to be animated, you can potentially just use this, but you have to make sure that the topology is clean. Sometimes it creates bad geo, especially if you have open faces. So if you're going to use a decimated model, you always want to take it back into Maya and double check and clean up any geometry, because sometimes it also creates really long triangles, and there's also a lot of unnecessary geometry sometimes as well. So that's what I do first. I decimate it, and if I get something that looks decent, I take it. In this case, this looks somewhat decent. It's not bad, but I would still need to clean it up a little bit. So let's actually take this into Maya and I'll show you how I will clean it up. Then maybe do one of these. Well, this is a really geometric shape, so it will be really easy to just kind of redo in Maya. Okay, so this would be our low poly model. And if we want to export that to Maya, let's go ahead and export that as an FBX. Okay, so that's that. But let's say you actually don't want to like use a decimated mesh as your final model. What you can do is you can still decimate it so that it's not super high poly. So let's go back to this. Okay, so I decimated that, and it's now like 66k, I mean 90k. And so if you don't want to use a decimated model as your final model, you can decimate this so that you still keep your details, and then this is what you're going to retopologize. So you're going to use this as your retopologizing model, and you have to make sure that it's not super high poly, because Maya doesn't usually work that great if you have really high poly models. And so that is if you're going to use Maya for retopology. So sometimes I use Maya and sometimes I use 3D Code. I find that 3D Code is a lot easier to use for retopology. So if you have access to it, I would highly recommend using that to do your retopology. So let's go back to Maya now. So this is the model that we decimated. And so like I said, what I would do is, first I'm going to assign the Lambert 1 instead. What I would do is I come here and then I will start to clean it up a little bit. So start merging some of the vertices that aren't really necessary in this model. So I will start to clean this up. You don't have to get rid of the triangles if you don't want to, but if you wanted to, like, if you want this to look cleaner, you can always get rid of the triangles and make it into quads. But this is what I would typically do, is I just reduce the poly count a little bit and then just simplify it. And make sure that there aren't any like weird, there isn't any weird geometry like here. So this is a little bit faster than retopologizing, but it also requires cleanup. Usually you can't just take a decimated model and use that. You have to usually clean it up to be able to really use it. So I start doing that, and then obviously I do it across the whole thing. And then once you have something that looks clean, I will do my UVs and then follow the exact same process of after UVing, exporting, and doing your stuff in Substance Painter. But obviously in this case, you could probably, because this is such a geometric shape, you could probably like try to replicate it here and then just like match your high poly. But if you have to retopologize, you can obviously use the Maya tools. So let's open the modeling toolkit, and then here what you want to do is you want to click on Make Live, and then use the Quad Draw tool. And so you want to start to retopologize by drawing some points, and then hold down Shift, click on the middle, and then that pretty much creates the geo. But that's pretty much how I would start to retopologize this. Obviously I would be using the high poly model because it has more details. But yeah, this is how I would start to retopologize it, and then once you have that done, do your UVs, and then follow the rest that I already showed you. So I hope me showing you the workflow is useful. Obviously, if you have any questions or there's anything that I didn't cover, let me know. So I showed you how to plan for an environment and how to think about modularity when you're creating an environment. I showed you in the last video how to stay consistent and in the style of the environment, how to plan for that as well. Obviously, I showed you in this video how to have a workflow that works and that you can use to create assets. The next thing I want to show you is how to actually create an environment from start to finish. So I will be showing you how to actually start from the beginning, how to create the props, how to export those and import them into Unreal Engine, how to create materials, how to create blueprints, how to create all sorts of things in Unreal, including the lighting, and how to get screenshots, renders out of that. And once you have gone through the whole process, you're going to be able to use pretty much the same techniques and be able to pretty much create anything you want as far as environments go, because what I'll be showing you is the process and the workflow and how to do it and what to think about. And then after that, you can apply all of those things that you learn from that and use them to create any environment that you want after that. And the skills that you learn from that are going to be transferable to pretty much any type of scene and even style. Even though what I'm going to be making is stylized, you can still use those, the learnings from that, and use them in different type of environments. And so some of the things that I'm going to be covering are how to create the modular pieces, how to make the assets, how to create terrain, and how to add textures and that you can blend into the terrain as well so that you don't get too repetitive looking terrain, how to make water, how to make foliage pieces, like grass, plants, and stuff like that, how to make trees, stylized trees, and how to put pretty much everything together into one scene and do some lighting, and finally some rendering out of that. So I'll be showing you all of the steps pretty much on how to create an environment, and you can follow along with not a lot of prior experience. You can follow along, and so stay on the lookout for that next email because a lot of that is going to be limited time only. And so you want to make sure that you don't miss out. So I'll see you next time.